Hello and welcome to Insomniac Dose. You're welcome to comment your city and the time below. I always enjoy reading them. If you find these stories interesting, please consider subscribing. Let's start tonight's story. The drive out to Point Morrow took longer than the map suggested. That should have been my first warning. When distance stops obeying geometry, when roads seem to stretch according to rules other than asphalt and miles. But I was focused on practical concerns. The truck's suspension groaning over potholes, the way my phone signal dropped to nothing about 20 minutes past the last gas station, the particular quality of light that happens when you're driving toward the ocean and the sky starts tasting like salt. My name is Ethan Callahan. I'm 29 years old, and until 6 weeks ago I worked in commercial HVAC installation in Halifax. The layoffs came during a slow winter, the kind that makes construction companies trim their crews down to skeleton operations. I could have found another position eventually, but my sister's divorce was messy and loud. My apartment was expensive and empty, and when the provincial Lighthouse Authority posted a temporary maintenance contract, 6 weeks room and board included decent pay, I told myself it was exactly the kind of reset I needed. Isolation, simplicity, honest work that didn't require me to navigate other people's problems. I met Marjorie Klein at the small harbor office in Whitestone, the last town before the point. The office smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times and marine varnish. Marjorie was somewhere past 60 with the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of squinting into coastal wind. She didn't smile when I introduced myself, just nodded once and slid a manila folder across the desk. "Ethan Callahan," she said, like she was confirming I was real. "You're replacing Dennis Howell. He lasted 9 days. What happened to him?" "He quit." She opened the folder, revealing standard paperwork, liability waivers, equipment checklists, and contact protocols. "Most people quit from loneliness, the lucky ones." The way she said it made something cold settle in my stomach, but I laughed it off. "I'm pretty good with my own company." "That's not what makes them quit." She pulled out a second page from the folder, this one on older paper, slightly yellowed at the edges. The header read, "Light Station Survival Rules. Read twice. Memorize." I glanced at it, expecting the usual safety protocols. Don't mix chemicals, wear a harness when working at height, keep emergency numbers posted. Instead, I found something else entirely. Rule 1. Never arrive at the lighthouse after sundown, even if the tide allows it. If you do, stay in your vehicle until sunrise. Rule 2. If the foghorn sounds 3 times when no fog is present, close every curtain and do not look outside for exactly 11 minutes. Rule 3. The boathouse door must remain closed between midnight and 5 a.m. If you find it open during these hours, do not close it yourself. Wait until dawn. Rule 4. If you hear someone knock on the cottage door at night, you may answer only if you hear 2 knocks. Pause, then 1. Any other pattern is not a person. Rule 5. Never whistle while in the lighthouse tower. Humming is permitted, singing is not. Rule 6. Never climb the tower stairs when the lighthouse lamp is off, unless the generator is running and the kitchen clock reads a time you trust. Rule 7. If the work radio turns on by itself, let it cycle through static for 30 seconds before turning it off. Do not speak during this time. Rule 8. If you see a figure on the rocks waving, do not wave back. Turn on the work radio and read your name aloud once. Rule 9. When conducting lamp maintenance, count the stairs as you ascend. Count them again as you descend. The numbers must match. Rule 10. If you wake to find wet footprints in the cottage that are not your own, trace them backward to their origin. Do not follow them forward to where they lead. I looked up from the page, certain this was some kind of hazing ritual for new contractors. "Is this a joke?" Marjorie's expression didn't change. "Do you see me laughing?" These read like, I don't know, folklore, superstition. Call it whatever you sleep. She tapped the page with one finger. Dennis called it that too, for about 4 days. What changed on day 4? She didn't answer. Instead, she handed me a pen. Sign the bottom, confirming you've read and understood all safety protocols. I signed, still half convinced this was some elaborate local tradition designed to unsettle mainlanders. Marjorie took the folder back, and for just a moment her professional mask slipped. She looked tired, the kind of tired that accumulates over years, not days. The road floods at high tide, she said. You've got 3 hours of good light left. I'd suggest you use them. The drive from Whitestone to Point Morrow followed a single-lane road that hugged the coastline, occasionally dipping so close to the water that spray misted my windshield. The landscape was all granite and scrub grass, twisted spruce trees that grew at angles suggesting the wind here was less weather and more ongoing argument with anything trying to stand upright. I rounded a curve and saw it, the Lighthouse. It stood on a rocky promontory that jutted into the North Atlantic like an accusation. The tower was white, maybe 60 feet tall, with a red lantern room at the top. Even in afternoon light, it looked severe, less like a navigational aid and more like a monument to the concept of warning. The keeper's cottage sat 30 yards from the tower's base, a low structure with dark windows that seemed to watch my approach. Behind the cottage, I could make out the generator shed, the equipment room, and down a rocky slope, the boathouse sitting at the edge of angry water. The place felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, not threatening exactly, but watchful. Like I was being observed by something that didn't rely on eyes. I parked near the cottage as the sun touched the horizon. Rule 1 echoed in my mind, and despite my skepticism, I felt relieved that I'd made it before dark. I grabbed my duffel bag and supply box, noting how quiet everything was despite the proximity to the ocean. The waves should have been louder. Instead, they sounded muffled, as if something was absorbing the noise before it could travel. The cottage door was unlocked. Inside, I found a small, practical space. A kitchen with a propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a sitting area with a worn couch, and a bedroom barely large enough for a single bed and dresser. Everything smelled like salt and old wood and something else, something organic and vaguely sweet, like flowers left too long in water. A clipboard hung near the door with a daily checklist. The previous entries were in Dennis Howell's handwriting, I assumed, neat at first, then increasingly erratic, with the last few days showing notes like Foghorn Y, and counted wrong, and on the final entry just, can't stay. I'm sorry. I set my things down and walked outside to inspect the grounds before losing the light. The lighthouse tower door was steel, painted red with a modern padlock. I had the key on a ring Marjorie had provided. Inside, a spiral staircase wound upward into shadow. I climbed slowly, counting without thinking about it. 63 steps to the lantern room. The lamp itself was a Fresnel lens assembly, beautiful in its geometric complexity, currently dark since dusk hadn't fully fallen. The glass panels of the lantern room offered a 360-degree view. Ocean to the east, rocky coastline north and south, and to the west, a dark tree line that marked where the land rose away from the point. I checked the electrical systems, the emergency backup battery, and the rotation motor. Everything appeared functional and well-maintained. But there was something odd about the space. A faint smell like ozone after lightning, and a coldness that didn't match the enclosed environment. When I descended, I counted again without meaning, to 64 steps. I stopped halfway down, pulse quickening. I counted the remaining steps carefully. 32 more, 64 total. I must have miscounted on the way up. Easy to do in poor light. I made a mental note to be more careful and headed back to the cottage as the last daylight bled from the sky. That first night I made a simple dinner, reviewed the maintenance schedule, and tried to convince myself that the rules were nothing more than accumulated superstition. Stories that grew in isolation, the way shadows seem darker when you're alone. At 9:17 p.m., while I was washing dishes, the foghorn blasted 3 times. The sound was deep and close, vibrating through the cottage walls, through my chest, through my bones. I froze, hands in soapy water, and looked toward the window. No fog. The night was clear. Stars were visible. The horn shouldn't have sounded. I dried my hands slowly, trying to reason through it. Malfunction, electrical fault. Maybe the system was more automated than I'd realized, and some sensor had registered false data. Then I remembered Rule 2. If the foghorn sounds 3 times when no fog is present, close every curtain and do not look outside for exactly 11 minutes. My rational mind rejected it. My survival instincts, older, wiser parts of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive when they didn't understand fire, told me to follow the fucking rule. I closed every curtain in the cottage, moving quickly but deliberately. I checked that the door was locked. I set a timer on my phone for 11 minutes and sat at the kitchen table staring at the glowing screen. The timer read 10:58 remaining when I heard the footsteps. They were outside, moving across the rocky yard between the cottage and the lighthouse. Slow, careful steps, the sound of bare feet on wet stone. I could hear the texture of it, skin against granite, the slight suction of moisture, the deliberate placement of weight. Something was walking around my cottage. The footsteps circled slowly, pausing occasionally. At one point, they stopped directly outside the kitchen window, just behind the closed curtain. I held my breath. Then came a new sound, scraping, like fingernails on painted wood moving along the window frame. Long, slow scrapes, as if something was testing the barrier, learning its dimensions. The curtain moved, not from wind, the window was closed. It moved as if something was pressing against the glass from outside, deforming the fabric, pushing inward. I could see the shape of it. Too tall to be a person standing on ground level, or else standing on something. The pressure created a bulge in the curtain, right at what would be head height. I stared at that bulge, every muscle locked, fighting the overwhelming urge to rip the curtain aside and see what the fuck was out there. The timer on my phone showed 4:12 remaining. The scraping continued, patient and methodical. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the front door. I heard something that might have been breathing, wet, arrhythmic, like lungs that weren't quite synchronized. Then a sound I'll never forget. Humming. Someone, something, was humming a melody I almost recognized. Not quite a lullaby, not quite a hymn. The kind of tune that feels wrong because it's slightly off-key in ways that aren't accidental. Timer 1:37, the humming stopped, the footsteps stopped. Silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breath, the blood moving through my veins. Timer 0:00. The alarm chimed, quiet and electronic. I waited an extra 30 seconds, then stood on shaking legs and moved to the window. I opened the curtain. The yard was empty, no figure, no footprints, no disturbance in the gravel. But the grass, sparse coastal grass growing in patches between rocks, was wet, soaked, as if something had dripped heavily while standing there. It hadn't rained. The night was clear. I checked every window. Same story. Wet patches beneath them, no other explanation. I spent the rest of that night sitting at the kitchen table with every light on, drinking coffee I didn't need, telling myself I'd imagined it. Auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and suggestion. The rules had primed me to interpret normal sounds as supernatural. But I couldn't explain the wet grass. Couldn't explain how the curtain had moved against closed glass. At dawn, I went outside to inspect the yard properly. The wet patches had dried, leaving slight discoloration in the grass. Salt residue like seawater. I checked the foghorn system from the equipment room. No faults in the log. No recorded activation during the night. According to the system, the horn hadn't sounded at all. But I had heard it. The cottage walls had vibrated with it. That afternoon, I radioed Marjorie on the designated frequency. I tried to keep my voice level and professional. "Had an incident with the foghorn last night," I said. "System shows no activation, but I definitely heard it. 3 blasts around 2120 hours. Static, then her voice. "Did you follow protocol?" I hesitated. "The rules, you mean?" Yes, I followed Rule 2. More static. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Then you did exactly right. Update the log with equipment status, otherwise normal operations." "Marjorie, what the hell is out here?" "The lighthouse, Ethan, just the lighthouse. Keep it running. Stay on schedule, follow the rules." The transmission ended. I stood in the equipment room, surrounded by maintenance manuals and spare parts and the ordinary machinery of modern infrastructure, and realized that Marjorie had just confirmed something I wasn't ready to accept. The rules weren't superstition. They were survival protocols for a place where normal causality had been negotiated into something else, something older, stranger, and infinitely more patient than human understanding. I looked at the rule sheet again, really reading it this time, seeing it not as folklore, but as a field manual for territory that didn't fully belong to our world. And I understood with perfect clarity that Dennis Howell hadn't quit from loneliness. He'd quit because he'd realized he was living in a place where the darkness had terms and conditions, and breaking them had consequences that couldn't be explained or survived. I had 5 weeks left on my contract. That first night I learned that the lighthouse at Point Morrow wasn't just a job. It was a test I hadn't agreed to take, administered by something that didn't care whether I passed or failed. It only cared that I played by the rules. The days that followed developed a rhythm, and I clung to that rhythm like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Routine became armor against the growing certainty that Point Morrow operated according to physics that had nothing to do with the laws I'd studied in school. Morning. Check the lamp assembly, inspect the lens for damage or debris, and test the rotation motor. Afternoon. Generator maintenance, fuel levels, battery charge status, and radio equipment. Evening. Light the lamp at dusk, log weather conditions, prepare dinner. Night. Stay inside, keep the lights on, try not to think about what might be walking around outside after the sun goes down. I followed every rule with religious precision. I memorized the knock pattern, 2, pause, 1, and tested myself repeatedly. I kept the boathouse door closed during the specified hours. I didn't whistle in the tower. I counted steps every single time I climbed or descended. 63 going up, 63 coming down, except for that first day when somehow the numbers hadn't matched. The work itself was straightforward. The lighthouse had been modernized in the 1980s with most systems automated or semi-automated. My job was essentially to be the human failsafe, to catch problems the automated systems might miss, to perform maintenance that required hands and judgment rather than sensors and algorithms. But the place was never truly quiet, even during calm weather. The ocean provided constant background noise, waves against rocks, wind through the tower's ventilation, the building's structural groans as the temperature changed. Beneath those sounds, though, I started noticing others. Sounds that didn't quite fit. Footsteps on gravel when no one was there, tapping on glass during windless hours. The occasional distant voice too far away to understand but close enough to recognize as human or human-shaped. I told myself I was adjusting to auditory patterns I wasn't familiar with. Isolation plays tricks. The mind fills empty spaces with phantom stimuli. Perfectly normal psychological phenomenon. On my 5th night, I learned just how desperately I was lying to myself. The weather had been clear all day. High pressure system, good visibility, light winds. I completed my evening routine and settled in with a book from the cottage's small library, a water-damaged mystery novel from the 1990s. The lamp was running smoothly, its beam sweeping the dark water every 15 seconds with mechanical precision. At 9:34 p.m., the foghorn sounded. 3 times. Deep, resonant, impossible. I was moving before conscious thought caught up, dropping the book, standing, moving to the windows. I yanked the curtains closed, checked the door lock, and set my timer. 11 minutes. This time I knew what to expect, but knowing didn't make it easier. The footsteps came almost immediately, as if whatever made them had been waiting for me to seal myself in. They circled the cottage, slow and methodical. I stood in the center of the kitchen, as far from the windows as possible, and forced myself to breathe steadily. The scraping started on the eastern window, long, deliberate scratches that set my teeth on edge. Then it moved to the southern window, then the western. Whatever was out there was circling, testing, learning the cottage's perimeter. Timer, 8:23 remaining. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I heard breathing, wet, labored, wrong. Too much air is moving through tubes that weren't shaped correctly. Then came the knocking. Knock, 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 knock. Wrong pattern, not 2 pause 1. I didn't move, didn't respond. The knocking came again, different this time. Knock, 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 knock. Rapid, urgent, demanding, still wrong. Then silence. 30 seconds of it, so complete I wondered if whatever was out there had left. When the knocking returned, it was perfect. Knock, knock, pause, knock. 2, pause, 1. My hand was on the doorknob before I realized I'd moved. Something in my hindbrain was screaming at me to open it, to acknowledge the correct pattern, to follow the rule. I hesitated, fingers wrapped around cold metal. The knocking repeated, knock, knock, pause, knock. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask who was there, when I noticed something that stopped me cold. The timer on my phone, 4:51 remaining. Something was knocking with the correct pattern, but it was knocking on the window when Rule 2 said I shouldn't be looking outside or interacting with anything beyond the walls. 2 rules in conflict, or one rule being tested against another. I stepped back from the door, not touching the lock, not speaking. The breathing on the other side became heavier, frustrated. Then I heard something that made my blood crystallize, my own voice. "Ethan, it's cold out here. Please open the door. It's me." Perfect mimicry, my voice, my speech patterns, my Nova Scotia adjusted accent. I followed the rules. My voice continued from outside. 2 knocks, pause, 1. You have to let me in now. That's the protocol. Timer, 2:15. I backed away until I hit the kitchen counter. The door handle rattled, testing, but the lock held. "You're breaking the rule," my voice said, now with an edge of something that wasn't quite anger. More like hunger, trying to sound patient. "You're supposed to answer when the pattern is correct. That's how this works. That's the agreement." Agreement. The word hung in the air, implying contracts I'd never signed, negotiations I'd never participated in, terms and conditions enforced by something that had been here long before the lighthouse was built. Timer, 0:45. "I can wait," my voice said. "I'm very patient, and you can't stay inside forever." Timer, 0:00. The alarm sounded. I waited a full minute before moving to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Nothing. No breathing, no footsteps, no presence. I opened the curtains on the door's small window and looked out. Empty yard. Empty night. The lighthouse beam sweeps faithfully across black water. But on the doorstep, directly in front of the door, was a wet outline, as if someone had stood there dripping seawater. And when they left, the water remained for just a moment, holding their shape. As I watched, the shape lost cohesion and soaked into the wood, leaving dark stains that faded as they dried. I spent the rest of that night reviewing the rules again, understanding now that they weren't just instructions. They were a negotiated peace treaty between the human occupants of Point Morrow and something else, something that had its own rules, its own patterns, its own purposes. The rules created a framework. Inside that framework, I was safe. Outside it, something was waiting to teach me exactly what happened when the framework broke down. The next morning, I inspected the door. The wood was slightly warped where the wet outline had been, as if exposed to intense humidity or heat. I found similar warping under the windows where the footsteps had paused. I was documenting this damage in the maintenance log when I heard an engine approaching. A vehicle is coming down the access road. I stepped outside, grateful for daylight and the prospect of human company. A provincial vehicle pulled up, a white truck with official markings. A man climbed out, mid-30s, wearing a fisheries officer uniform, grinning as he'd just heard the world's best joke. "You must be Ethan," he said, extending a hand. "Caleb Mercer. I'm supposed to check on you, make sure you haven't gone completely crazy yet." I shook his hand, appreciating the normalcy of the gesture. "Define completely," he laughed. "Fair enough. This place has a reputation for getting into people's heads. Dennis lasted, 9 days? The guy before him made it 3 weeks. You're at 5 days, so you're actually doing pretty well. What's the record? For not quitting?" Caleb leaned against his truck. "An old guy named Thomas Brennan made it 7 months back in the 90s. Of course, he didn't quit, he just disappeared one night during a storm. They found his boots on the rocks, laces still tied, like he'd stepped right out of them into thin air." I tried to determine if he was joking. His expression suggested he wasn't. "I'm supposed to do a safety check, make sure you've got adequate supplies, radios. Working standard welfare visit," Caleb continued. "Mind if I come in?" We spent the next hour going through protocols. Caleb was efficient and professional, but also dismissive in the way people are when they've grown too familiar with something to find it strange anymore. He'd been working this coastline his entire adult life, and Point Morrow was just another assignment to him. When he noticed the rule sheet posted on the wall, he rolled his eyes. "Jesus, they're still giving these out? That's Marjorie for you. She's been working lighthouses for 30 years and treats every weird noise like it's a ghost. You don't think there's anything to them? The rules?" He laughed. "Ethan, this is Nova Scotia. We've got old fishing families who won't say certain words on boats, who throw coins to the sea for luck, who have 40 different superstitions about fog. It's all cultural carryover. The rules are just the Lighthouse version, stories that got codified over time until somebody typed them up to sound official. But, look, I get it. The place is isolated, the sounds are weird, and your brain starts making patterns out of nothing. That's why they rotate people through. You're not supposed to stay long enough to start believing the stories." He clapped my shoulder. "Just keep the light running, don't let the silence get to you, and you'll be fine. Another 5 weeks and you'll be back in Halifax telling your own spooky lighthouse stories at parties." I wanted to tell him what I'd experienced, the foghorn that didn't register in the system, the footsteps. The voice uses my own speech patterns. But looking at Caleb's easy confidence, his dismissive certainty, I realized he just attributed all to stress and isolation. So I said nothing. I smiled and nodded and played the role of the rational contractor who didn't believe in ghost stories. Caleb finished his inspection and promised to check in weekly. "Radio if you need anything," he said. "And seriously, don't let this place get in your head. It's just a lighthouse." He drove away, leaving me alone with the sound of the ocean and the growing conviction that Point Morrow was anything but just a lighthouse. That night I dreamed I was climbing the tower stairs, counting as I went, 63 steps up. But when I reached the lantern room and started back down, the stairs stretched impossibly, and I counted 70 steps, then 80, then 100, descending into darkness that shouldn't exist below ground level. Following stairs that went down and down and down into cold spaces where the lighthouse beam couldn't reach, and something waited at the bottom with wet hands and my own stolen voice, calling me deeper into negotiated spaces where rules were written in languages humans weren't meant to speak. I woke to the sound of the foghorn, 3 times, deep and close. I closed the curtains and set my timer, now practiced enough that my hands didn't shake. This time, whatever circled, the cottage hummed while it walked, and the melody was the same one from my dream. The song from the bottom of the stairs that shouldn't exist. I was beginning to understand that the lighthouse wasn't just operating by different rules. It was teaching me those rules, one terrifying lesson at a time. The routine took on a desperate quality after Caleb's visit. I threw myself into maintenance work, finding tasks that didn't strictly need doing just to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. I repainted sections of the tower's exterior. I cataloged supply inventory down to individual screws and washers. I cleaned equipment that was already clean. Anything to avoid thinking too hard about what happened after sunset. Caleb returned 6 days later as promised. This time he brought fresh supplies, groceries, batteries, a new propane tank, and more of his easy skepticism. We shared coffee in the cottage while he filled me in on gossip from the coastal communities treating Point Morrow like it was just another location on his route, nothing special, nothing strange. I'd almost convinced myself to believe him. Almost. That evening, after Caleb had gone back to town, I was in the equipment room performing routine radio checks when I happened to glance out the window toward the ocean. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of copper and blood. The weather was calm, that eerie Atlantic calm where the sea goes flat as glass and the air feels like held breath. Then I saw it, a flare, distant but unmistakable, a red distress flare arcing up from the water about half a mile offshore, blooming bright against the darkening sky before falling and extinguishing. My training kicked in immediately. Someone was in distress. I reached for the radio to contact the Coast Guard, fingers already moving through the protocol I'd memorized, when I heard gravel crunching outside. Caleb. His truck was pulling back up the access road. "Did you see that?" he called out as he jumped from the vehicle. "Flare just offshore. I was 10 minutes down the road when I spotted it." "I was about to radio it in," I said. "Radio takes too long. I've got the skiff. We can be out there in 15 minutes. He was already moving toward the boathouse, energized by the prospect of action. "Could be fishermen in trouble, engine failure, taking on water. Come on." I followed him down the rocky slope toward the boathouse, but something was wrong. Something about the situation felt off, like a note played slightly out of tune. The flare, on calm water, no radio distress call. I'd been monitoring the emergency frequencies all day. Just a silent flare appearing from nowhere. "Caleb, wait!" He was already at the boathouse door, pulling it open. Inside, the small rescue skiff sat ready, orange and white, equipped with a reliable outboard motor and emergency equipment. "Wait for what? Someone might be drowning." I tried to remember the rules, but there were so many, and I'd been focused on the ones about the cottage and the tower. Had there been one about the water? About boats? I pulled out my phone, found the photo I'd taken of the rule sheet. There. Not a numbered rule, but a notation I'd seen in Dennis Howell's frantic handwriting, scrawled in the margin: "If you see a flare on calm water with no radio call, do not launch. The water is requesting you." "Caleb," I said more urgently, "we can't go out there. Not without radio confirmation. Not without what? Jesus, Ethan, someone could be dying." He was climbing into the skiff, prepping the motor. "You can stay if you want, but I'm not leaving some poor bastard to drown because of superstitious bullshit. The rules are stories." He yanked the motor's starter cord. It caught immediately, rumbling to life. "I've worked this coast for 15 years. I know what real danger looks like, and it's not fairy tales about ghost keepers." I stood on the dock, torn between obligation, someone might genuinely need help, and the growing certainty that the flare was wrong, that the calm water was wrong, that everything about this was a carefully constructed invitation to step outside the framework that kept the lighthouse inhabitants safe. Caleb gunned the motor, pulling away from the dock. I watched the skiff cut across the glassy water, leaving a wake that seemed too symmetrical, too perfect, like the ocean was parting specifically to let him pass. He'd covered maybe 200 yards when the fog appeared, not rolled in, appeared. One moment the water was clear, visibility perfect in the dying light. The next, a bank of fog sat where Caleb was heading, as if it had been waiting beneath the surface and simply decided to rise. The skiff entered the fog and I lost visual contact. But I could still hear the motor, that distinct two-stroke sound, steady and mechanical. Then the sound changed. It became repetitive, like the same 2 seconds of motor, like noise playing over and over, a loop that shouldn't be possible with analog machinery. The sound didn't fade with distance, it just repeated, the same audio pattern cycling endlessly. I stood on the dock, cold settling into my bones that had nothing to do with the wind temperature. The foghorn blasted once, not the usual pattern, not 3 times like the Rule 2 encounters. Just once, sharp, wrong, like a signal rather than a warning. Then I heard something else, a sound like metal striking metal, hollow and resonant. Once, twice, then silence. The motor sound stopped. The fog didn't dissipate naturally. It collapsed, folded in on itself like something living that had finished feeding and no longer needed to maintain its shape. Within seconds, the water was clear again. No skiff, no Caleb, no sign of anything had been there at all. I stood frozen, mind struggling to process. I should go after him. I should launch the backup tender from the equipment shed. I should... The skiff's motor sound started again, close. Too close. I spun around. The skiff was drifting back toward the dock, motor off, moving against the current with gentle precision. No one was steering it. No one was aboard. It nudged against the dock with a soft bump, rocking slightly. I approached slowly, looking for Caleb, hoping he'd fallen overboard, hoping he was clinging to the far side, hoping for any explanation that didn't require me to accept what I was seeing. The skiff was empty. Caleb's jacket lay folded on the seat, neatly folded, impossibly neat, corners aligned with geometric precision. The fabric was completely dry, despite being on a boat that had just traveled across open water. On the seat beside the jacket was a wet patch, roughly hand-shaped but too large. The fingers, if they were fingers, would have been 9 or 10 inches long, and there were too many of them. 6, maybe 7, radiating from a palm that suggested something had gripped the seat with enough force to leave. Moisture pressed deep into the fiberglass. I backed away from the dock, pulse hammering. I needed to report this. I needed to call the Coast Guard, Marjorie, or someone. I ran back up to the equipment room and grabbed the radio. "Point Morrow Station to Whitestone Authority. Emergency. Repeat, emergency." Static, then Marjorie's voice, calm and unsurprised. "Go ahead, Point Morrow. Caleb Mercer launched to investigate a distress flare. He's gone. The boat came back empty. I need search and rescue. I need..." "Did you wave at anything?" The question was so specific, so disconnected from what I'd just reported, that I stopped mid-breath. "What? Did you wave at anything on the rocks? Did you signal anything in the water?" No, I followed the rules, but Caleb..." "Did Caleb follow the rules?" I closed my eyes, understanding what she was really asking. No. He launched during suspicious circumstances. I tried to stop him. A long pause. We'll file the report. Coast Guard. We'll conduct a standard search, but Ethan, you know they won't find him. How can you know that? Because he was requested, and when the water requests someone, it keeps them. Her voice softened slightly. You did everything right. You tried to warn him, that's all you could do. Marjorie, what the fuck is happening at this lighthouse? The lighthouse is performing its function. The question is whether you can perform yours. Can you keep the light running? I looked out at the water, now peaceful in twilight, looking like water should look, normal, governed by tides and wind and mundane physics. Yes, I said, because what else could I say? Then that's what you do. Log the incident, continue operations, follow the rules. The transmission ended. I filed the report mechanically, documenting times and observations, writing it like a standard incident report because my mind couldn't process it any other way. The Coast Guard launched a search at dawn. They found nothing, no debris, no body, no evidence that anyone had been on the water at all. Caleb Mercer was listed as missing, presumed drowned. An investigation was opened. Interviews were conducted via radio. I told them the truth. He'd launched to investigate a flare, entered a fog bank, and didn't return. I didn't mention the fog appearing from nowhere. Didn't mention the looping motor sound. Didn't mention the handprint with too many fingers. They closed the investigation after 2 weeks, ruling it a tragic accident. Local fishermen weren't surprised. The waters around Point Morrow had a reputation. People went missing sometimes. The sea kept its secrets. But I knew it wasn't the sea. It was something that used the sea, that moved through water like water was just another room in a house that extended far beyond what humans could map or measure. That night, I added my own notation to the rule sheet, under Dennis Howell's warning about flares. They learn the forms, they learn the patterns, they send signals that look right but feel wrong. Trust the feeling. I also added skepticism is not protection. Caleb died because he thought understanding the coast meant understanding what lives there. It doesn't. The lighthouse beam swept the dark water, patient and mechanical, and I realized it wasn't guiding ships away from danger. It was marking territory, defining a boundary, maintaining an agreement that something had made with something else long before I arrived. And Caleb had stepped across that boundary without permission. The water had simply exercised its contractual rights. After Caleb disappeared, I stopped pretending the rules were metaphorical. They were operational instructions for navigating a reality that had different physical laws than the one I'd grown up in. Point Morrow existed in a space where the normal and the impossible overlapped, and the rules marked the boundary between staying human and becoming something else. I became obsessive about following them. I counted stairs every time. 63 up, 63 down, never varying. I closed the curtains at the first sound of the foghorn. I tested the knock pattern on the door frame every night before bed, rehearsing my response. I read my name aloud when needed, kept the boathouse closed during specified hours, and never whistled in the tower. But following rules I didn't fully understand left me vulnerable to threats I couldn't anticipate. I needed to know more, not just what the rules were, but why they existed, what they were protecting me from, and what had negotiated them in the first place. The cottage had limited resources, a shelf of water-damaged paperbacks, some old magazines, and basic maintenance manuals. But the equipment room attached to the lighthouse had more, filing cabinets filled with decades of documentation. I started searching during daylight hours when the place felt marginally safer. The recent logs were mundane, maintenance records, weather observations, supply orders. But as I worked backward through the files, the entries became more interesting. Former keepers had documented strange occurrences, usually dismissed or rationalized, but present nonetheless. From 2018, foghorn activated without trigger. Checked system, no faults found. Possibly electrical interference from a storm. From 2015. Heard knocking at night, did not answer. Knocking continued for 45 minutes, then stopped. From 2009. Witnessed unusual light reflection from water. Appeared to move independently of the lighthouse beam. Likely bioluminescence or fishing boat spotlight. Each entry was someone trying very hard to explain away something that couldn't be explained. The rational mind protects itself from implications it couldn't survive accepting. But the older logs were different. I found a filing cabinet from the 1970s and 80s, and the entries became blunt. Keepers from that era seemed less concerned with maintaining rational explanations. They documented phenomena and moved on, as if strangeness was simply part of the job description. From August 1984, the keeper named Douglas McPherson. The old light is active again. Saw it from the lantern room at 0347 hours. Second beam offshore, rotating counter 2 hours. Shut the curtains and waited it out per protocol. Recommend supply run include extra lamp oil despite the modern electrical system. Old protocols should be maintained. Old light, protocol that predated the electrical system. I dug deeper, finding a box of archived materials from the 1950s. The logs from this era were handwritten in various scripts, some meticulous, some nearly illegible. Many entries referenced the one below, and included routine prayers or incantations at the end of otherwise standard reports. From November 1957. Heard the one below walking during low tide. Stayed inside per instructions from Keeper Baines. 3 hours of footsteps circling the tower foundation. It left at dawn. Light remains operational. From March 1961. Spoke with the Guardian today. She brought herbs and salt. She says the contract is holding, but the boundary has worn thin near the North Rocks. Performed reinforcement ritual as instructed. No incidents this month. Guardian? Contract? Reinforcement ritual? I kept searching, working backward through decades, finding references that became more explicit the older they got. The lighthouse had been built in 1887, and the earliest logs treated the supernatural elements as fact, not speculation. But many pages were missing. I'd find entries dated June 3rd, June 4th, then jump to June 12th with no explanation for the gap. The missing sections were torn out cleanly, suggesting deliberate removal rather than damage. The gaps clustered around certain dates, late October, early November, late February. Storm season and the transitional periods between seasons. In a filing cabinet marked Historical Records, I found something that made my hands shake. A leather-bound journal, older than the lighthouse itself, dated 1881-1886. It appeared to be a surveyor's log from when they were determining where to build the station. The early entries were professional, soil composition, wind patterns, tide data. But by 1883, the tone shifted. The locals warn against building on the point. They speak of something that lives in the water, something that has claimed this territory for longer than their grandparents can remember. They call it the lessor, not lesser, but one who leases land, who holds title. They say any structure built here will be subject to its terms. 1884. Construction crew reports ongoing difficulties, tools go missing. Workers hear voices. 3 men quit yesterday, refusing to return regardless of pay. The project manager insists these are delaying tactics to negotiate higher wages. I am less certain. 1885. Met with a local woman named Ariadne Hale, who claims to have negotiated with the lessor on behalf of the construction. She provided a list of conditions, rules essentially, that must be followed if the lighthouse is to operate safely. I have filed these with the provincial authority. They believe she is mad. I believe we should listen. The next several pages were torn out. The journal resumed in 1887. The lighthouse is operational. Keeper Brennan has been provided with the conditions as transcribed from Miss Hale. He is skeptical, but has agreed to follow them to humor local superstition. I pray he takes them more seriously once he experiences what we experienced during construction. That was the final entry. The surveyor's name at the end, Marcus Cavanaugh. I searched for more information about Ariadne Hale but found nothing in the official records. As far as the provincial authority was concerned, she'd never existed. But the rules existed. The same rules I'd been following, with minor variations, had been in place since before the lighthouse was built, which meant something the lessor had negotiated terms with Ariadne Hale over a century ago, and those terms still governed Point Morrow. I needed to understand those terms better. I needed to find the missing pages. I searched the equipment room thoroughly, checking for hidden compartments or folders I'd missed. Nothing. I searched the cottage, looking under furniture, behind shelves. In the bedroom, I found a loose floorboard. Not obviously loose, I only noticed because I'd dropped a pen and it rolled toward the wall at a slight angle, suggesting the floor wasn't quite level. I pried up the board with a screwdriver. Underneath was a small waterproof container, the kind used for camping or boating. Inside the container, a notebook more recent than the historical logs, with the handwriting much less formal. The first page. If you're alone, read this. The notebook belonged to Thomas Brennan, the keeper Caleb had mentioned, the one who disappeared in the 1990s. It was dated across several years, 1990, 1996, and it wasn't an official log. It was a personal journal of observations and annotations to the rules. Brennan had been meticulous. He documented every anomalous event, every test of the rules, every consequence of following or breaking them, and he'd added his own rules. Refinements based on experience. Do not trust the cottage clocks after midnight. Set a wind-up timer if you need an accurate time. The digital clocks will lie. If the lamp turns itself off, do not turn it back on until you hear the waves change rhythm. The darkness is brief if you wait. It's permanent if you interfere. If you see the beam shining across the water and it illuminates something that reflects, shut your eyes and count to 40. Do not open them before 40. Do not count past 40. Each rule had a note attached explaining the consequence of violation. Brennan had seen someone violate the reflection rule. He didn't describe what happened to them, only wrote, he counted to 35, got impatient, opened his eyes. When they found him, his eyes were open, but everything behind them was gone. Like someone had reached through and scooped out whatever makes sight into seeing. I read through the entire notebook over several hours, learning what Brennan had learned. Point Morrow wasn't haunted. It was occupied. Something lived in the territory around the lighthouse, something that had agreed to allow human presence under specific conditions. The rules weren't protection from a threat. They were the terms of a lease, and breaking them was a breach of contract. The final entry in Brennan's notebook was dated February 14, 1996. I've figured out what the lighthouse is really for. It's not a navigational aid, it never was. The beam isn't warning ships away from rocks. It's marking the boundary, showing the lessor how far its territory extends. We're not keepers of the light. We're maintainers of the contract. We keep the beam running so the boundary stays defined. If the beam fails for too long, the entry stopped mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank. Thomas Brennan disappeared 2 weeks later. I closed the notebook, understanding now why keepers didn't last long. It wasn't loneliness or isolation. It was the knowledge. The understanding that you weren't really human anymore when you were at Point Morrow. You were a function, a role, a living clause in an agreement you hadn't signed, but were bound by nonetheless. That night I experienced something that made Brennan's annotations terrifyingly relevant. I was in the lantern room doing routine maintenance when the lamp died. Not flickered, died. Complete darkness despite the generator running normally, despite all systems showing operational status. I remembered Brennan's rule. If the lamp turns itself off, do not turn it back on until you hear the waves change rhythm. I stood in the dark lantern room 63 steps above the ground, surrounded by glass, listening to the ocean. The waves had their normal rhythm, steady, consistent, the usual pattern of swell and crash. Then the rhythm changed. The waves became syncopated, hitting the rocks in a pattern that felt wrong. Not random variation, deliberate pattern. Like something conducting them, changing natural chaos into an organized signal. 3 hits, pause, 2 hits, pause, 3 hits, pause, 2 hits. It repeated for exactly 1 minute, then returned to normal. I flipped the lamp's main switch. The light blazed on, beam resuming its sweep as if nothing had happened. I descended the stairs, counting carefully, 63 steps down. In the cottage, I added Brennan's rules to my personal notes. I was maintaining 2 rule sets now. The official ones from the provincial authority and the hidden ones from keepers who'd survived long enough to understand what they were really dealing with. I also added a note of my own. The lighthouse isn't a warning to ships. It's a warning to us. It marks how far we can go before we're in territory that doesn't belong to us anymore. The beam doesn't light the water to help boats. It lights the water to remind the lessor of where it agreed not to go. We don't maintain the lighthouse, we maintain the boundary. And something on the other side is getting impatient with the arrangement. That night I dreamed of Ariadne Hale standing on the rocks in 1885, negotiating with something that rose from the water like a question made of flesh, and I understood that the rules she'd established were eroding, that the contract was old and the lessor was testing its terms, looking for loopholes, waiting for the boundary to fail. I had 3 weeks left on my contract. I was beginning to understand I might not make it that long. The days after finding Brennan's notebook felt different. I'd crossed some invisible threshold, not of the contract itself, but of awareness. Knowing what the lighthouse really was, what the beam really marked, changed how I experienced Point Morrow. I started seeing the patterns everywhere. The way the fog moved wasn't random, it had intention. The way seabirds avoided certain rocks even when fish were visible in the water below. The way the grass grew in the yard, there was a perfect circle, maybe 15 feet in diameter, where nothing green would take root, as if the earth itself remembered something being there that soil wouldn't tolerate. I documented everything in my own journal, continuing Brennan's work. I tested the rules gently, carefully. Nothing that would constitute full violation, just observations about boundaries. When the foghorn sounded its 3-blast pattern, I checked. The system never logged activation. When I heard footsteps at night, I measured the time they walked, always in multiples of 11 minutes. 11, 22, 33, as if working according to mathematics that used different base numbers than human counting. The lessor had its own logic, its own patterns. Understanding them might give me an edge. Or it might just let me understand exactly how I'd die when the contract finally failed. I was conducting lamp maintenance my 15th day at Point Morrow when I heard a vehicle approach. Not the provincial truck. Different engine sound. I descended the tower and saw a battered pickup parked near the cottage, older than Caleb's vehicle, rust-spotted with local plates. A woman stood beside it, unloading supplies from the bed. She was perhaps late 60s, weather-worn face, gray hair pulled back severely, and wearing practical clothing that had been mended multiple times. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd done this same task many times before. I approached slowly. "Can I help you?" She glanced up, assessed me with quick, intelligent eyes, then returned to unloading. You're Callahan, the new keeper. You've lasted longer than the last two. And you are? Nora Daly. She set a box of supplies on the ground, canned goods, batteries, lamp oil. I bring what you need. What the provincial authority forgets or doesn't think you need. Marjorie knows I come. Thank you. But I have supplies. You have what they think you need. She pulled out a small canvas bag, moved toward the cottage, then stopped 5 feet from the door. She set the bag down, stepped back. Salt, herbs, iron filings, these go inside. You carry them. I don't cross the threshold. Why not? She looked at me like I'd asked why water was wet. Because I'm not contracted. The cottage is safe for you because you're the keeper. I enter that space. I'm in negotiated territory without terms. The lessor would have rights I couldn't contest. The casual way she said it, the lessor, confirmed she knew exactly what Point Morrow really was. You know, I said, not a question. My husband was the keeper here. Martin Daly, 1989 to 1994. He lasted 5 years. Smart man, careful man, followed every rule. She paused, something painful crossing her face. He died the night he tried to leave. Decided he'd had enough, packed his truck, drove out just after sunset. His truck went off the road 3 miles inland. They said he swerved to avoid something. They never found what he swerved to avoid, just found his truck upside down in a ditch and Martin dead in the driver's seat with his hands still on the wheel. Jesus, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't make the lessor less real. She studied me. You've read the logs. You found the hidden notes. I can see it in how you stand. You're waiting for something now, not just working. That's good. Waiting means you're aware. Do you know what it is? The lessor? Nora shook her head. Knowing what it is isn't the point. The point is knowing what it does, what it allows, and what it doesn't allow. Martin spent 5 years trying to understand its nature. He'd have been better off just understanding its patterns. But there must be something. History, local knowledge. There's stories, old ones. Aeropol avoided this point long before Europeans arrived. They had their own name for it. Roughly translates to the place where water claims ownership. When the British wanted to build the lighthouse, locals warned them. They built it anyway. And the locals were right. She moved back to her truck, retrieved another bag. This andon she opened, showing me the contents: a bundle of dried sage, a small iron horseshoe, salt packed in a mason jar, and several handwritten notes on yellow handwrittenese are from your husband. And from Brennan before him, and from others before that. Instructions that don't make it into the official rules because the provincial authority doesn't believe in what they can't measure. She pulled out one of the papers, read it. If it calls you by your full name, don't answer. It's counting syllables. Why would it count syllables? Names have power in old agreements. Your full name, first, middle, last, that's your complete designation. If the lessor uses your complete designation, it's trying to invoke the full weight of the contract on you specifically. If you answer to that invocation, your spondonfirming the contract applies to you personally, not just to the position of keeper. Never answer to your full name. Answer to keeper or lighthouse operator or anything generic that doesn't bind you individually. I thought about the night the voice had mimicked me calling from outside the door. It had said Ethan, but not my full name. Had it been testing? Learning? What else should I know? Nora looked toward the lighthouse, then the ocean, then back to me. If you hear someone crying on the rocks, it's testing your kindness. Don't go to help. The lessor uses human impulses against us: compassion, curiosity, fear. It learns what moves us and uses that knowledge. Crying is bait. Caleb, I said quietly. He saw a flare. He wanted to help. And the water requested him for it. Her voice held no judgment, just sad confirmation. The lessor rewards rule-following and punishes rule-breaking with perfect consistency. That's the only mercy in the contract. It's predictable. Stay inside the terms. You stay safe. Step outside and consequences are immediate. She handed me the bag of supplies. One more thing. When the beam fails, not if, when, don't fix it first. Confirm you're still you. How do I do that? Something only you would know. Memory, scar, habit, something that can't be mimicked. Because when the beam fails, the boundary weakens. Things can cross that normally can't. And one of the things that tries to cross is you, or something wearing you, trying to get permission to be inside the boundary. The implications made my skin crawl. Something could replace me. Something could try. That's why the rules about names, about answering doors, about knocking patterns, they're all verification protocols, ways to confirm you're dealing with what you think you're dealing with. She climbed into her truck. I'll be back in 2 weeks. If you're not here, I'll tell Marjorie you made it 29 days. That's respectable. Wait, how do I contact you if I need help? She paused, key in the ignition. You can't. Help isn't part of the contract. You're alone here, Ethan. That's the whole point. The lessor requires isolation. It requires you to make decisions without support, without consultation. Every keeper is a test case. You either figure it out or you don't. She drove away, leaving me standing in the yard with a bag of occult supplies and the understanding that I was even more on my own than I'd realized. That night, I organized Nora's supplies carefully. Salt in small containers placed on windowsills. Iron filings in a line across the door threshold. Sage hanging in the kitchen. The written notes I read repeatedly, memorizing them until they were as familiar as the official rules. At 10:47 p.m., I heard crying. It came from the direction of the North Rocks, beyond the boathouse. A woman's voice sobbing desperately, the kind of crying that suggests real pain, real need. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go help, to find whoever was hurt, to do something. I stood at the cottage window, the curtain pulled back slightly, and watched the rocks. Nothing visible, just darkness and the sound of crying moving slowly along the rocks as if someone was stumbling, injured, looking for help. The crying stopped directly between the cottage and the lighthouse. The voice called out, "Please, I'm hurt. I need help, please." Female voice, young, terrified. Everything about it was designed to trigger protective instinct. I gripped the window frame and did nothing. The voice waited. 30 seconds, 1 minute. Then it changed tactics. "Ethan, I know you're there. I can see the light. Please help me." Not my full name, just Ethan, testing to see if I'd answer. I remained silent. The voice became angry. "You're supposed to help people. That's what lighthouses are for. You're breaking the rules by ignoring someone in distress." That almost got me. The inversion of logic, suggesting that not helping was the violation. But Nora's warning was clear. Testing your kindness. Using human impulses against you. The crying resumed, moving back toward the water. It continued for exactly 22 minutes, then stopped abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. Silence. Normal night sounds. Waves against rocks. I checked the yard from every window. Nothing. No footprints, no figure, no evidence that anything had been there. But on the North Rocks, visible in the lighthouse beam when it swept that direction, I saw wet marks, as if something had been standing there, dripping. Not footprints exactly, more like water stains in shapes that suggested a figure but with proportions that weren't quite right. The marks dried quickly, salt white against dark stone, then faded entirely. I added a note to my journal. The lessor uses need as bait, distress, signals. cries for help, requests that seem legitimate. It's testing for the moment you prioritize human instinct over contract terms. The moment you do, you're in breach. I also wrote, Nora won't help, can't help. She's outside the contract and has to stay that way. Martin tried to leave and died. The contract doesn't end when your term is up. It ends when it decides to end you. I have 19 days left on my official contract. I'm beginning to understand I might be here much longer than that. The lighthouse beam swept the water, marking the boundary, confirming the terms, maintaining the agreement that something had made with something else over a century ago. And I was the current living clause in that agreement, trying to survive long enough to understand exactly what I'd become when I signed my name on Marjorie's paperwork. Not an employee, a hostage to geography that didn't obey normal rules. A keeper of terms I was only beginning to comprehend. The days after Nora's visit, I became hyper-aware of patterns. Everything at Point Morrow operated according to rhythm, the lighthouse beam's 15-second rotation, the tides on their 12-hour cycle, the way the lessor tested the boundaries at specific intervals. I started documenting these patterns obsessively, looking for predictability in the chaos, searching for the underlying algorithm that governed when and how the violations occurred. The foghorn sounded 3 times. Foghorn venti 2 to 96 hours. Never less than 72, never more than 96. The footsteps that circled during those 11-minute windows always moved clockwise. The knocking, when it came, always occurred between 1 and 3 a.m., never outside that window. Understanding the patterns didn't make them less terrifying, but it gave me a framework. I could prepare. I could anticipate. I could brace myself for what was coming rather than being ambushed by it. On my 21st day, a storm rolled in, not the gentle fog that appeared from nowhere. A real Atlantic storm, the kind that makes the ocean violent and the wind strong enough to lean into. I'd been monitoring weather reports and knew it was coming, had secured loose equipment, and double-checked the generator and fuel levels. The storm hit at 6 p.m., just as dusk was falling. Rain lashed the windows, wind screamed around the cottage, and the lighthouse beam seemed to struggle against the darkness, barely penetrating the sheets of water. By 8 p.m., the power flickered. The generator was running, but something about the storm was interfering with the electrical system. The cottage lights dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. At 9:30, the lighthouse beam stuttered, a momentary darkness, maybe 2 seconds, then resumed. I was in the cottage kitchen monitoring systems on the backup laptop when the beam died completely. Not flickered. Died. The lantern room went dark. I checked the generator, running normally. I checked the electrical panel. All breakers are in the correct position. I checked the system diagnostics. Everything showed operational, but the lamp was off. I remembered Brennan's rule. If the lamp turns itself off, do not turn it back on until you hear the waves change rhythm. I stood at the window, rain hammering the glass, and listened. The waves had their normal storm rhythm, chaotic, powerful, overlapping. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind of darkness that makes you question whether your eyes are actually open. Then the waves changed. The chaos organized itself into pattern. 3 large swells hit the rocks, pause. 2 smaller swells, pause, repeat. The same pattern the foghorn had made weeks ago. Foghorn pattern I'd been hearing in various forms since I arrived. The ocean was signaling, or something was using the ocean to signal. The pattern repeated for exactly 1 minute, then returned to storm chaos. I went to the equipment room, climbed the tower, stairs, counting carefully, 63 steps, and entered the dark lantern room. I reached for the lamp's main switch, hesitated. Brennan's other rule. When the beam fails, don't fix it first. Confirm you're still you. I stood in the darkness, rain hammering the glass walls, and tried to think of something that would prove my identity. But prove it to what? To myself? To something watching? I pulled out my phone, opened the Notes app, and wrote, "My name is Ethan Michael Callahan. I was born in Portland, Maine. My sister's name is Rebecca. When I was 8, I fell through the ice on a pond and my father pulled me out. I have a scar on my right shin from a bicycle accident when I was 12. My favorite food is my mother's chicken stew. I took this job because I needed distance from Rebecca's divorce and from my own failures." I read it aloud in the darkness, hearing my voice absorbed by rain noise and wind. Then I held up my right hand, palm out, looking at the scar across my thumb, from when I'd cut it on sheet metal during an HVAC installation 3 years ago. "That's me," I said. "That's proof." I flipped the lamp switch. The light blazed on, beam resuming its rotation, cutting through storm darkness. I descended the stairs, counting. 63. In the cottage, I documented what had happened, adding my own note. The beam failure is a test. When the boundary weakens, you become vulnerable to replacement. The lesser might try to put something else inside the keeper's role. Confirmation of identity reestablishes the contract with the correct party. The storm continued through the night. I stayed awake, monitoring systems, listening to rain and wind, and trying not to think about what might happen if I'd turned on the lamp without confirming my identity first. At 1:03 a.m., I heard knocking on the cottage door. My entire body went rigid. Outside was a storm that could kill someone in minutes. If someone was actually out there, actually knocking, they were in genuine danger. But the rules. The knocking came again, rapid, frantic, desperate, wrong pattern, not 2-1, just chaos knocking. I moved to the door but didn't touch it. "Who's there?" A voice barely audible over the storm. "Help me, please, let me in." Male voice, unfamiliar, young, maybe mid-20s. "How did you get here?" I called through the door. "Boat, engine failed. I swam to shore, the engine A's, I'm freezing." Hypothermia was real. If someone was actually outside in this storm, actually wet and cold, they could die. But the knocking pattern was wrong. "Knock again," I said. 2 knocks, pause, then 1. Silence, just the storm. Then, knock, knock, pause, knock, perfect, exactly right. My hand moved toward the lock. Something deep in my survival instincts was screaming at me to open the door, to help, to prioritize human life over superstitious rules. But Nora's warning echoed. The lessor uses human impulses against us, and Brennan's note, it can learn patterns. It cannot learn hesitation. I stepped back from the door. "What's your name?" David Chen. "Please, I need help." "Where did you launch from?" "Whitestone." "I was fishing. Please." "What's the name of the harbor master in Whitestone?" Pause. Too long. "I don't know. I'm not from there. I just launched there. Please open the door." I knew the harbor master's name. It was on documents I'd signed. If this person had launched from Whitestone during a storm warning, they'd have interacted with the harbor authority. "What's your boat's name?" Another pause. Then the voice changed. Became colder. "You're being unkind. Someone is dying on your doorstep and you're asking questions. If you're really David Chen, you can answer basic questions." The knocking resumed. Not frantic anymore. Slow. Deliberate. The same 2-1 pattern repeated over and over with mechanical precision. Knock, knock, pause, knock, 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 pause, knock, 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 pause, knock. It continued for 45 minutes, never varying, never stopping. The same pattern looping like a recording, like something that had learned the sequence but didn't understand the meaning behind it. At 1:48 a.m., the knocking stopped. I heard footsteps moving away from the door, slow and careful despite the storm, as if the person walking was unaffected by wind or rain. The footsteps circled the cottage. I tracked them by sound, moving from window to window. Whatever was out there was learning the building's perimeter again, updating its knowledge. The footsteps stopped at the bedroom window. I heard breathing, that same wet, wrong breathing from weeks ago. Then a voice, speaking with my exact speech patterns. Ethan Michael Callahan. My full name. Complete designation. I said nothing. Didn't acknowledge it. Didn't confirm. The voice continued, using my voice. I know you're in there. I know you can hear me. The storm can't last forever. Eventually, you'll have to come outside. And when you do, I'll be waiting. I'm very patient. Then it laughed, using my laugh but wrong, timing slightly off like someone who'd studied laughter but never genuinely experienced it. The breathing stopped. The presence withdrew. I checked the window and saw, briefly illuminated by the lighthouse beam, a figure moving toward the rocks. It walked through the storm unaffected, rain passing through it rather than hitting it, wind not touching it. The figure reached the rocks and stood there, facing the cottage, perfectly still despite the violence of the storm around it. It stood there until dawn. When light finally broke, the figure dissolved. Not walked away, dissolved like mist, like something that could only maintain form in darkness. I spent that morning checking the cottage perimeter. On the doorstep, I found wet marks shaped like hands, but with too many fingers, 6 or 7 per hand, radiating from palms that were too wide. Under the bedroom window, I found similar marks and something else, words traced in salt water on the stone foundation, already drying but still legible. We know the patterns now, not I, we. As if there were multiple entities, or as if the lessor was collective, or as if what I'd been dealing with was just one manifestation of something larger. I photographed the message before it dried completely, then documented everything in my journal. I added a new rule based on the night's experience. When something uses your full name, do not answer. When something uses your voice, do not acknowledge it. When something uses the correct knock pattern, verify with questions only the real person could answer. The lessor has learned the patterns, it cannot learn the context behind them. Yet, that final word felt important. The lessor was learning, adapting, testing new strategies. The rules that had worked for a century might not work forever. The contract was eroding not just through violation, but through the lessor's increasing sophistication. It was getting better at being human. And I was running out of time to figure out how to stay human while living in its territory. I had 13 days left on my contract. The lighthouse beam swept the water, mechanical and faithful, marking a boundary that was becoming increasingly theoretical. Something was testing that boundary from the other side, pressing against it, looking for the moment when the terms would finally fail, and it could cross completely. I was beginning to understand that moment might come before my contract ended, and when it did, I wouldn't be the keeper anymore, I'd be the kept. By my 25th day at Point Morrow, I'd developed a routine so precise it bordered on obsessive-compulsive. Wake at 6 a.m., check the lamp, visual inspection, system diagnostics, breakfast while monitoring radio frequencies. Morning maintenance, generator, batteries, fuel levels, afternoon tasks, tower inspection, groundskeeping, equipment testing. Evening routine, light the lamp, manually even though it's automated. Verify all locks, close specific curtains in specific order. Set timers and alarms for the night ahead. The routine was armor. The routine was protection. The routine was all I had against the certainty that the lessor was getting better at finding loopholes. Marjorie radioed every 3 days now, always the same questions. Is the light operational? Are you following protocols? Do you need early extraction? I always answered yes, yes, no. But the truth was more complicated. The light was operational, but it was failing more frequently. momentary darknesses that the system didn't log, stutters in the beam's rotation that lasted seconds. I was following protocols, but the protocols were becoming insufficient against an entity that was learning faster than the rules could adapt. And I desperately wanted extraction, but I was beginning to understand that leaving might not be possible. Martin Daly had died trying to leave. Dennis Howell had quit, but I didn't know what had happened to him afterward. Thomas Brennan had disappeared. The contract seemed to require completion, not just of the time period, but of something else, some cycle or term that wasn't written in the paperwork. On the evening of day 25, another storm hit, bigger than the last one. The Weather Service had been tracking it for days, a low-pressure system that was expected to bring severe winds and heavy seas. I'd prepared everything I could, securing equipment, checking backup systems, and stockpiling supplies in case the access road flooded, and I was cut off completely. The storm arrived at 4 p.m., 3 hours before dusk. By 7 p.m., the wind was strong enough that I could hear the lighthouse tower groaning, the metal and concrete structure flexing in ways it wasn't meant to flex. Rain hammered horizontally, and the ocean became something alive and angry, waves reaching heights I hadn't thought possible here. The lamp struggled. Its beam barely penetrated 50 feet through the storm, and even that illumination was intermittent, constantly broken by sheets of rain and spray. At 8:47 p.m., the lamp died. Not flickered, not stuttered, complete, total darkness. I checked the generator, running perfectly, actually running better than usual, as if overcompensating. I checked the electrical panel. All systems showed operational. Power was flowing correctly. According to every diagnostic tool I had, the lamp should be on. But the lantern room was dark. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the tower stairs, counting automatically. 63 steps. The storm noise was worse in the tower, the wind creating harmonic frequencies in the structure that sounded almost like voices, almost like something singing. In the lantern room, I performed a physical inspection. The bulb was intact. The Fresnel lens assembly was undamaged. The rotation motor was functioning. I tested the electrical connections, all solid. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready to produce light. But darkness remained absolute. I remembered Brennan's rule. If the lamp turns itself off, do not turn it back on until you hear the waves change rhythm. I stood at the lantern room windows, surrounded by glass, suspended 60 feet above the ground in a metal tower during a lightning storm, and listened. The waves were chaotic, storm patterns, no discernible rhythm beyond random violence. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15 minutes of darkness while the lighthouse sat useless, while ships potentially approached the coast without warning, while the boundary marked by the beam failed. What happens when the boundary fails? 20 minutes. I was beginning to think the waves wouldn't change, that this time was different, that I was supposed to take different action. Then it happened. The chaos organized itself, but not into the simple 3-pause-2 pattern I'd heard before. This was complex, multiple rhythms layering over each other, as if different sections of waves were moving according to different rules. Some hitting in triplets, others in pairs, others in long single swells, but all of it somehow coordinated, all of it meaning something. The ocean was speaking in compound sentences. The pattern continued for 2 minutes, then degraded back to chaos. I reached for the lamp switch, hesitated, remembered the second part of Brennan's instruction. When the beam fails, don't fix it first. Confirm you're still you. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The storm had killed that. But I opened my notes app, the entry I'd made during the last failure, and read it. My name is Ethan Michael Callahan. I was born in Portland, Maine, but something was wrong. The words on the screen weren't quite what I'd written. Small changes. My sister's name was listed as Rachel instead of Rebecca. The detail about falling through ice mentioned a lake, not a pond. The scar was on my left shin, not right. Someone had edited my notes, or something had accessed my phone and changed the details, corrupting my own memory anchors. I looked at my right shin. There was a scar. I was certain there was a scar. I rolled up my pant leg in the darkness, using my flashlight. No scar. Smooth skin. I checked my left shin. Scar. Right where the note said. But I remembered it being on the right. I had vivid memories of the bicycle accident, of falling, of the handlebar impacting my right shin, of blood and pain and my mother's worried face. Except that the evidence was left. Was I wrong? Had I misremembered my own history? Or was something changing reality around me, rewriting the details, replacing my memories with edited versions? I stood in the dark lantern room, storm screaming around me, and tried to think of something I could verify, something that couldn't be changed. The scar on my thumb, the sheet metal cut. I held up my right hand, examining it in flashlight beam. No scar. Then, unmarked thumb. I checked my left hand. No scar there either. Panic started rising. I tried to remember other verifiable facts. My father's name. I knew it was Robert, or Richard. Richard Robert. The details were slippery, like trying to hold water. My apartment address in Halifax. It was on Barrington Street? No, Birmingham? The numbers were 342 or 324, or who was I? Ethan Callahan, 29 years old. HVAC technician, recent layoff. Sister is having divorce problems, took this job for isolation and income. But as I recited these facts, I couldn't attach concrete details to them. Couldn't remember my sister's face clearly. Couldn't visualize my apartment. Couldn't recall my last day of work. It was like someone had given me a character description but removed the actual character. The darkness in the lantern room felt heavier suddenly, more present, as if something was occupying the space with me, something that had been waiting for this moment of uncertainty. I heard breathing, not my breathing, coming from behind me. I turned slowly. A figure stood at the top of the stairs. Dark shape, human proportioned but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It didn't move, just stood there, breathing in rhythm with me, matching my respiratory rate exactly. "Hello, Ethan," it said in my voice. I backed against the lantern room glass. "Who are you?" "I'm you. The you that follows the rules and doesn't doubt. You've become unstable. Your memories are corrupting. The contract requires a stable keeper. I'm the replacement." It stepped into the lantern room, and in the flashlight beam I saw its face. My face. Exactly my face, down to the smallest detail. Except the eyes were slightly too bright, reflecting light like an animal's eyes, like something that had evolved to see in darkness. "You can't replace me," I said, voice shaking. "The contract is with me specifically. The contract is with the keeper of Point Morrow Lighthouse. Identity is just a formality, and your identity is failing. You can't remember your own history. You don't know what's real anymore. The boundary requires certainty. You're just uncertainty in human shape." It was right. I didn't know what was real. Couldn't trust my own memories. But there was something it had said that was wrong. Something that gave away its nature. The you that doesn't doubt. The real Ethan, me, was full of doubt. Always had been. Doubt about career choices, relationship choices, life direction. Doubt was my defining characteristic. I'd taken this job partly because I doubted my ability to do anything else successfully. Doubt was human. Certainty was something else. "If you're me," I said carefully, "you were the real reason I took this job." "Isolation and income," it answered immediately. "No, that's the reason I told myself. What's the real reason?" It hesitated. "Just a fraction of a second, but enough. I don't understand the question." The real me does. I took a step toward it, forcing confidence I didn't feel. I took this job because I was scared. Because my sister's divorce reminded me I don't maintain relationship that well. Because being laid off felt like confirmation that I'm mediocre at everything I try. Because isolation meant I didn't have to confront any of that. I could pretend I was choosing solitude instead of admitting I'm avoiding life. The figure's expression didn't change, but something in its posture shifted, became less certain. I'm not successful, I continued. I'm not particularly brave. I'm not even good at this job. I'm terrified every single night. But I'm me, full of contradictions and doubts and fears and all the messy human shit that makes identity real. That's instability, the figure said. The contract requires a human keeper. Not a perfect keeper, not an idealized keeper, a human one, with all the doubts and failures and contradictions that implies. I moved to the lamp switch. I'm Ethan Michael Callahan. I'm inconsistent and scared, and I barely know what I'm owing. And that's exactly who I need to be right now. I flipped the switch. The lamp blazed on. Light flooded the lantern room, and in that light the figure's face changed. The features melted, shifted, became something approximating human but not quite achieving it. It stumbled backward, and I saw what it really was. Something made of darkness and water and intention, trying to hold human shape but failing as light exposed the gaps in its construction. It reached for me with hands that had too many fingers, then dissolved. Not violently, just dissipated like mist under direct sunlight. I stood alone in the lantern room, beacon blazing, storm screaming outside, legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I descended the stairs slowly, counting with exaggerated care. 63 steps down. In the cottage, I tried to reconstruct what had happened. The lamp failure had created a boundary weakness. Something had crossed, maybe the lessor itself, maybe something it sent. It had tried to replace me, to install itself in the keeper's role by eroding my confidence in my own identity. It had almost worked. I checked my phone. The notes were back to their original form, Rebecca, not Rachel. Pond, not lake. But I still couldn't find the scars I remembered. Either they'd never existed and I'd been given false memories, or they'd been removed as part of the replacement attempt. Either option was terrifying. I added a new rule to my journal, handshaking as I wrote. The handshaking enter when the beam fails completely. It will try to work with a version of yourself that follows the rules without questioning them. It wants a keeper who's pure function, no personality. Resist by embracing your flaws. The contract requires humanity, and humanity is defined by imperfection. Your doubts are your protection, your fears are your armor. The moment you become certain, you're vulnerable to replacement. The storm continued through the night. The lamp stayed on, beam cutting through rain and darkness, marking the boundary that I'd almost failed to maintain. At dawn, the storm broke. I went outside to inspect damage and found, written in the wet sand near the Lighthouse foundation, words that made my blood freeze. Next time. Not a threat. A promise. The lesser was patient. It had failed this time, but it was learning from each failure, getting better, finding new angles. I had 9 days left on my contract. I was beginning to understand I might not survive all 9. The final days took on a dreamlike quality, as if I was living in a space between states, not quite waking, not quite sleeping, suspended in the strange temporality that Point Morrow created around itself. Time felt negotiable, as if the hours stretched or compressed according to rules that had nothing to do with clock mechanisms. I stopped trusting time. The cottage clocks showed different hours. Never drastically different, just off by minutes, as if each clock was measuring time slightly differently, as if Point Morrow existed in multiple temporal streams simultaneously. I used my wind-up timer for everything, the mechanical ticking a reassurance that at least one form of measurement wasn't compromised. The nights were worst. Even when nothing worse supernatural occurred, the atmosphere felt pressurized, like living inside a held breath. I'd lie in bed listening to the lighthouse beam's rotation motor, counting the intervals, using the mechanical rhythm to anchor myself to something predictable. On day 31, 5 days beyond my original contract, though Marjorie had extended it due to my survival, I found another hidden journal. I was conducting structural inspection in the AA Lighthouse Tower's basement access, checking the foundation for storm damage, when I noticed a brick that sat slightly proud of the others. I pulled it free and found a small waterproof container behind it. Inside, a journal belonging to Ariadne Hale, the same woman who'd negotiated the original contract in the 1880s, the guardian who'd given the rules to the construction company. Her journal dated from 1881 to 1887, covering the period when the lighthouse was being planned and built. Her handwriting was meticulous, educated, someone who'd been trained in careful documentation. The early entries detailed her background. She was a doctor's daughter, educated beyond what was common for women in that era, interested in folklore and indigenous knowledge. From March 1883, the Mi'kmaq elder speaks to water warned me again about the point. She says the lessor has been here for longer than human memory, that it claims territory through attention. Where we look, where we build, where we insist on presence, the lessor interprets as challenge. Building a lighthouse use here is declaring ownership of space it has held for centuries. From July 1883. I've made contact. I won't describe the method here, but the old ways still work. The lessor is not hostile by nature, but it is territorial. It operates according to ancient agreements that predate human concepts of property. It will allow the lighthouse if terms are established, if rules are followed. From November 1885, I've negotiated the contract. 10 primary rules with variations and subclauses. The lessor learns quickly. It understands patterns, mimicry, repetition. The rules create boundaries that it cannot cross without invitation. But the contract requires maintenance, a human presence, continuous, serving as witness and enforcer. The keeper's role is sacred. Break it and the contract becomes void. From March 1887. The lighthouse is operational. Keeper Brennan is in place. I've instructed him thoroughly, though he doesn't fully believe. They rarely do at first. The lessor will test him. It tests everyone. That's the nature of boundaries. They must be proven repeatedly or they fade. The final entry, dated May 1887. I'm ill. Consumption, the doctor says. Ironic that I, who dealt with something that transcends death, will die from something as mundane as disease. I'm leaving this journal here hidden, in case someone needs to understand what this place really is. The lighthouse isn't infrastructure. It's a ritual object maintained through human presence and adherence to negotiated terms. The beam doesn't warn ships. It defines what belongs to humans and what belongs to the lessor. When the light fails, the boundary fails. When the keeper fails, the contract fails. I pray those who come after understand this. I pray they're strong enough to maintain what I've established. Below this, in shakier handwriting, a postscript. The lessor visited me last night. It knows I'm dying. It asked if the contract dies with me. I told it no. The contract lives in the rules, in the lighthouse, in the continuous chain of keepers. It seemed satisfied. But it said something before it left. Your kind thinks in generations, we think in tides. The contract is young. We are patient. The journal ended there. I sat in the tower basement, cold stone around me, reading Ariadne's words and understanding that what I'd been experiencing was a conversation that had been ongoing for over a century. The lessor testing boundaries, keepers maintaining them. An endless negotiation between human presence and something older, stranger, more fundamental than human understanding could comfortably accommodate. I was the latest iteration in a long chain. Not special, not chosen, just the current function holder in a contract that would outlast me. That night I radioed Marjorie. I need to know what happens when my contract ends. Static then. You leave. New keeper arrives. Standard transition. What happened to Dennis Howell after he quit? Longer pause. He's fine. Living in Halifax, working construction. Have you spoken to him? Ethan, why are you asking? Because I need to know if leaving is actually possible. Because I found Martin Daly's story and Thomas Brennan's journal and now Ariadne Hale's records, and every one of them suggests the contract doesn't end just because the paperwork says it does. The radio silence stretched so long I thought she'd terminated the connection. Then, some keepers leave and live normal lives, some don't. It depends on whether the lessor considers the contract fulfilled. What determines fulfillment? I don't know, no one does. Ariadne might have known, but she died before documenting that part. All we know is that some keepers walk away clean. Others... She paused. Others stay connected. They hear the foghorn in places where no foghorn exists. They see the beam at night, even inland. The lighthouse keeps calling them. Is there a way to ensure clean separation? Follow the rules. Maintain the light. Complete your term without violation. That's all we can tell you. The rest is between you and whatever's out there. The transmission ended. I had 5 days left. I had 5 days to maintain perfect adherence, perfect function, perfect keeperness. On day 33, I woke to silence. Complete, absolute silence. No ocean sound, no wind, no mechanical hum from the generator or refrigerator. Nothing. I got out of bed, moved to the window. Outside, the world was frozen, not cold, frozen. Waves stopped mid-motion, suspended in air. Seabirds hung motionless in the sky. The lighthouse beam was stopped mid-rotation, light extending in a solid line across paralyzed water. I was in the gap between moments, in the space where time wasn't flowing. I heard footsteps behind me in the cottage, turned slowly. A woman stood in the kitchen, old weathered face wearing clothing from another era. I knew her from the photograph I'd seen in historical records. Ariadne Hale. You're doing well, she said, voice clear and English accented. Better than most recent keepers. You're dead. Death is contextual at Point Morrow. Here, time isn't a line, it's a loop, a spiral, a negotiated space. I'm always here in the moment I made the contract, just as you'll always be here in the moment you maintained it. I don't want to always be here. No one does. But the contract requires witnesses, requires continuous human presence across time. You're not just keeping the light for now, you're keeping it for always from the perspective of the lessor. It perceives time differently. To it, all keepers exist simultaneously, all maintaining the boundary at once. I tried to process this. So I can never actually leave? You'll leave physically. You'll return to your life. But part of you will remain, locked in the moments you maintain the boundary. The lessor holds those moments, keeps them, uses them to maintain the contract. She moved closer and I saw she was translucent, not quite solid. The question isn't whether you leave, it's whether you leave intact. How do I ensure that? By accepting what you are now, not fighting it, not denying it. You're a keeper. That identity is permanent. But if you integrate it rather than resisting it, you remain whole. If you try to pretend this never happened, the part of you that stays here will grow, will consume more of you until you're more lighthouse than human. That's what happened to Brennan? He fought it, tried to understand it intellectually rather than accepting it experientially. The lesser doesn't respect intellectual understanding. It respects acknowledgement, acceptance, continuity. She began fading. 3 days left. Maintain the light. Accept your role. When you leave, don't look back. The lighthouse will call you sometimes. Let it. Answer when it calls. That's how you stay whole. She disappeared. Time resumed. Waves crashed, wind blew, birds moved, mechanical systems hummed. I stood in the kitchen, morning light streaming through windows, and understood that I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. I wasn't just employed at Point Morrow, I was bound to it, part of its operational framework, written into the contract Ariadne had negotiated a century ago. The final 3 days were quiet, almost suspiciously quiet. The lesser didn't test me, didn't send phenomena or apparitions. It was like it knew the contract was being fulfilled and was simply waiting for me to complete the term. On the morning of day 34, my replacement arrived. A young woman, maybe 25, looking eager and optimistic in the way people do when they don't yet understand what they've agreed to. Her name was Sarah Kim. We did the official transition. Equipment walkthrough, supply inventory, maintenance schedule review. And then I gave her the unofficial transition. I showed her the rule sheet, watched her expression shift from skeptical to uncertain. "I know how this looks," I said. "But these rules aren't metaphorical, they're survival protocols. Follow them exactly, don't test them, don't assume you know better." "Did you follow them?" "Every single one, that's why I'm still alive." I gave her my journal, along with Brennan's and Ariadne's. "Read these. Understand what this place is. You're not just a maintenance contractor, you're a contract holder. You're maintaining a boundary that's been negotiated for over a century. Take it seriously." She looked at the journals, at me, at the lighthouse. "You really believe all this? In 3 days you will too." Marjorie arrived to complete the paperwork. She drove me back to Whitestone, and we didn't speak during the drive. What was there to say? At the harbor office, she handed me final payment and a document to sign, confirming contract completion. "You did well," she said. 34 days. That's the longest completion in 5 years. What happens now? You go home. Resume your life. Try to forget this place." "Can I forget?" She looked at me with tired eyes that had seen too many keepers come and go. "No. But you can learn to live with remembering. Some do." I drove back to Halifax, returned to my apartment, tried to resume normal life. But Ariadne was right. The lighthouse had kept part of me. 3 weeks after leaving Point Morrow, I woke at 2 a.m. to a sound I knew impossibly well. The foghorn. 3 deep blasts vibrating through my apartment walls. I looked out the window. My apartment was on the 7th floor, 20 miles from the ocean. There was no foghorn, no lighthouse, no RF foghorn explanation. But I heard it, and something in me responded. The part that was still there, still maintaining the boundary, still serving the contract. I grabbed my phone. A notification glowed on the screen from an unknown sender. "Light check due, do not arrive after sundown." I went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror. My reflection looked back, but for just a moment. Just a fraction of a second, its eyes were too bright, reflecting light like something adapted to darkness. Then normal. Just me. Tired, marked by the experience, but intact. Mostly intact. I pulled on clothes, grabbed my keys, and started driving. Not toward Point Morrow. I wasn't going to make that mistake. Just driving, moving, trying to put distance between myself and the call. I felt pulling at some part of me that wasn't entirely mine anymore. My phone buzzed again. Text message, no number. "You don't have to return, you're still fulfilling the contract. Part of you never left. This is how it works, this is how it's always worked." I pulled over, hands shaking. The lighthouse was calling me, but I wasn't there. Part of me was still there, still climbing those 63 steps, still counting, still checking the lamp, still maintaining the boundary between what humans claimed and what the lessor held. I would hear the foghorn for the rest of my life, feel the pull of Point Morrow, would wake sometimes not knowing if I was in my apartment or the keeper's cottage, if I was in the present or locked in the continuous loop of maintenance and vigilance that the contract required. Ariadne had tried to warn me. You'll leave physically, but part of you remains. I resumed driving, heading nowhere, just moving, trying to understand how to live as a person who was simultaneously here and there, now and then, keeper and kept. Somewhere on the Nova Scotia coast, Point Morrow's lighthouse swept its beam across dark water, marking the boundary, maintaining the contract, defining the space between what belongs to humans and what belongs to something older. And part of me was there, counting steps, following rules, keeping the light burning in a negotiated space where time was a loop and contracts were written in patterns humans weren't meant to fully understand. The lighthouse had kept my shift, and it would keep it forever, a permanent witness to the moment I'd maintained the boundary, locked in continuous service to an agreement made before I was born. I drove through the night, the foghorn sounding in my mind, my reflection in the rearview mirror, occasionally showing eyes that were just slightly too bright. The contract was fulfilled, but it would never end. That's the real horror of Point Morrow. Not that the lessor exists, not that the rules are real, but that once you become a keeper, you're always a keeper. Somewhere in some eternal present, I'm still there, counting steps, following rules, maintaining the boundary forever.